partly from his doctoral dissertation, or that was it your dissertation you were doing with Ken Ferrara there, or that was an aside?
A little spin-off project.
Okay. So Ken Ferrara is a renowned gerontologist, one of the best, and worked with Markus at Purdue. And they did some really interesting work on early adversities and cancer in particular, which was my particular introduction. So Markus is an associate professor here at University of Toronto in sociology, and one of our associated members, we're very proud to have, at the Institute for Life Course and Aging. He completed his PhD in sociology and in gerontology at Purdue, and his research lies mainly in the area of health and aging. So some of the topics that interest him include adult health problems associated with childhood adversity, which was my introduction to his work, the influence of health on social networks among older adults, the role of physical environment in shaping older adults' social connectedness and health, and his work on networks and health is funded by the Province of Ontario's Early Research Award and by SHRC. And he currently serves as an associate editor on the Journal of Gerontology Social Sciences, which is one of our biggest gerontology journals. So with no further ado, thank you so much, Markus.
Well, thanks. Thank you for the nice introduction, S.K. And thanks to all of you for being here today and braving the monsoon-like weather to get here. I know I'm kind of soaked from the feet up to the knees. We're walking over here, so I know it was a little bit of a treacherous journey. Today I'm going to present on this paper. It's kind of a work in progress called The Propagation of Disorder in Later Life, Neighborhood, Home, and Body. And I guess I would just like to keep this presentation somewhat informal. If there are points you'd like to interject on, please just go ahead and shout them out. We can talk about things as they come up, and I would really appreciate any feedback that you have, because this very much is a sort of work in progress overall. I'm going to start the presentation by noting that orderliness, many sociologists would contend, is really a concerted social accomplishment. Orderliness in many realms of life doesn't happen automatically, but it's worked at, it's accomplished by actors. And of course, orderliness can take many different forms. The project I'll be talking about today is really focusing on sort of physical types of order and disorder. The Oxford English Dictionary defines order as the harmonious configuration of things in physical space. And so we would sort of look to disorderliness as sort of the opposite of that, when things break down from a harmonious, socially expected type of arrangement in some kind of a space. And for a long time, different types of sociology have looked at different realms of order and disorder in physical space. So urban sociologists going back to the early part of the 20th century, particularly in what's known as the Chicago School of Sociology, were really interested in this line between order and disorder in physical spaces in neighborhoods. And they sort of pointed to the ways in which the breakdown of order in neighborhoods was a really striking statement to people that would enter neighborhoods. It could sort of signal a threat to people that came in if there was trash or signs of obvious decay in the neighborhood. And so they really talked a lot about the sort of striking visuality of disorder. Of course, in our homes as well, those are places too where we can maintain order or let order slip away. People that live in dirty, sort of unkept or odorous houses are oftentimes pointed to as examples of social deviance and failing to live up to sort of conventional expectations of the way that households should look like. And sociologists have done quite a bit of work noting how order is maintained in homes. And finally, the last layer of order that I'll be talking a little about today and trying to draw connections between is the body itself. So people, of course, also perform orderliness on their physical bodies. Scholars of embodiment, particularly sociologists working over in Europe mostly, have sort of called our age as the sort of somatic society, the time in which bodies are sort of seen as expressions of people's identity, as sort of physical sites where people can accomplish things and sort of show themselves to be upstanding, good members of society. That's sort of the thesis of the somatic society literature that comes out of Europe. And so becoming disorderly, sort of letting one's body go in some sense, is somewhat of a transgression of a moral code in this age of the somatic society, or so says that theory of embodiment. And so I, along with some of my collaborators here at U of T, have sort of been thinking about order and disorder at these various spatial levels and tried to think through what impact might order or disorder have for older people. And so before I get to sort of the thrust of today's presentation, that is the propagation of disorder across space in older adulthood, Just a sort of brief snapshot of some of the work that we've been doing to try to sort of inform or motivate this overall project. So I'm showing right here a graph. This is a paper that's coming out just in the next couple months. And what I'm looking at in this paper, to sort of set the stage, is asking the question of, does household disorder moderate the effect of disablement on social connectedness? So this is one realm where I think that disorder in physical space makes a difference for older people. A lot of literature says that when older adults become disabled, they see a drop-off in their social connectedness. Their social networks start to winnow down. They have less engagement or activity with their neighbors or others in the community. So what I did in this particular analysis was I was looking at how do people's social networks change after they become disabled, and how might the environment in which they live really shape or moderate that pattern or that association. So as you see, the sort of left 3 bars show people that are not disabled. And you can see for those people, there really isn't any kind of statistical difference between the social network size, the core social network of people that were non-disabled across 2 aids of this study. However, for people that did become disabled, so across 2 points in time, they were not disabled, but then they had some activity of daily life difficulty over time, you really see that you see now a disparity between people that live in really orderly types of household environments, represented by that dark black line on the right cluster, and people that live in very disorderly types of environments, represented by that sort of diagonal crossed line. And so people that live in really disordered home environments, and I'll talk a little bit about how I operationalize that concept later on this afternoon, but people that live in really disorderly spaces, they are the ones who really see this huge drop-off in terms of their social network after they become disabled. So it seems to moderate the effect of disablement. Another paper that some of my collaborators and I have worked on recently is about looking at couples, older people that live together, and sexual interest of those couples. And what we find is that particularly for husbands, the more disordered the household is, the more unkempt, the more odorous, the more disheveled or dirty or odorous the household space is, the more that seems to cut into a lack of sexual interest among those people living together with their partner. So it seems like living in a unkept space does have some implications perhaps for older couples in terms of maintaining sexual interest in later life. And as a third sort of example, looking now at the case of embodied disorder, or sort of bodily presentation of order and disorder, this last graph shows mortality. So we're plotting the predicted probability of death over 5 years' time. And what I show in this sort of first line, I'm not really able to go and point to the picture very effectively here, but this sort of first line that sweeps up most strongly, that dark black line, this sort of shows the relationship between disorder and bodily self-presentation in terms of poor hygiene, poor dress, being associated with a much higher level of death the further along that x-axis you go in terms of bodily disorder. Now what we do is we control for all the sort of things you might think might be explaining that association: frailty, geriatric syndrome, disease, poor mental health, poor cognitive status. And controlling for all of those other things, we then arrive at this second line, which is that sort of dotted line, and we still see a sort of basically a twofold increase in the predicted probability of death if you start with really orderly really orderly self-presentation on the left side of the graph to the right side of the graph, where these are people that have really high levels of embodied self-disorder, things like poor hygiene, poor dress. So there still seems like there's a really strong signal being sent about pending death if you just look at the way people present their bodies, net of all of these other really strong predictors. So that just sort of gives you a little bit, I think, of a snapshot of some of the ways we're thinking about using signs of order or disorder as predictors of important things in the lives of older adults. So now we come to this sort of project I'll be presenting on today, the sort of main project for today. The question we have today is, does environmental disorder, or sort of signs of physical order disorder, do they propagate over time across levels of different space? So we sort of said that you can look at disorder and order in the neighborhood, in the home, or even upon the body. And so we're looking at, are these actually just discrete signals of order and disorder for older adults, or is there actually some kind of connection? Can we actually see disorder propagate across time and across space? Question: why should we care about the sociospatial disorder, this issue among older adults? And hopefully this sort of 3 empirical examples I used just a few moments ago give you some ideas of why we think this matters. But one of the things that we would argue is that aging really reduces physiological and cognitive competence and makes seniors more susceptible to stressors in their environments. So forms of chaos or unpredictability, whether it's on the neighborhood or whether it's sort of happening in the home itself, could really have an outsized impact, we think, on older adults because of their reduced physical and cognitive competence. What's even more than that, I think, is that older adults, relative to other people, spend a lot more time in their immediate proximal environment, whether it's due to retirement or sort of...
I think you can have mental illness and have...
Disorder and order directly intersects with social stratification in a really powerful way. Racialized minorities, people in lower socioeconomic standing, are really most likely in many places in North America to live in the most disorderly types of neighborhoods, to live in neighborhoods that are marked by the most breakdown of physical order. Other past research has also shown that racialized minorities, low SES adults are also most likely to live in homes that are considered to be more disorderly, as well as many of the outcomes that seem to be linked to disorder, things like nursing home admission, premature disability, and death, can all be predicted by environmental disorder. And there are also things where we clearly see a lot of social disparities in terms of those outcomes. So I'm going to go just briefly over sort of the ways in which we're conceptualizing physical disorder as informed by literature. I already talked briefly about the Chicago school tradition as sort of being this early attempt by social scientists to really carve out and explain what order and disorder means, how to conceptualize it, what it looks like. Back in terms of this neighborhood research, back in the early parts of the 20th century, the Chicago school sort of defined, first of all, disorder as a type of an outcome. If you have places that are marked by rapid turnover in terms of the population, people moving in, people moving out, if you have poor economic conditions happening at the neighborhood level, racial discrimination or other social problems, disorder in many ways can be an outcome of these sort of broader structural factors happening in the city. Subsequent sociologists have also sort of argued that disorder as well is a cause of other things, that it can actually cause other social phenomena. So one of the most famous articulations of this view is the so-called broken windows thesis. And this is the idea that if you have a disorderly neighborhood, places where you see graffiti on the walls, broken windows that aren't tended to, trash and clutter in the streets, that sort of gives ne'er-do-wells license to come in and break into cars and vandalize more property or mug people. And sort of bad behavior, according to that theory, is sort of fostered by a disorderly type of physical condition. Other sociologists have sort of picked up on this theme and sort of said that disorder can also cause things like health problems or mental health and stress issues. So disorder as an outcome, but also disorder as a cause. Environmental gerontology has sort of also gotten a little bit into the idea of picking up on themes of order and disorder, but tended a lot more to the home condition as a place where order and disorder can take place. Not only the neighborhood, but also the home as a space where order can be maintained. The key sort of argument of environmental gerontology, especially the person-environment fit model, which really leads the way in a lot of environmental gerontology research, is the idea that there should be a sort of match between people's competence and the press or the stressors of their environment. And when those things become out of balance, you have suboptimal aging happening, right? And so we could think about, in many ways, home disorder as being some kind of a mismatch of the pressures or stresses of the environment and someone's competence in order to deal with those things. And then finally, the embodiment literature also talks about the sort of tenuous nature of order and disorder, especially how people try to maintain that in their body. Much qualitative research in the embodiment literature points to the way in which chronic disease becomes the sort of key point in people's lives where it's really hard to maintain the integrity of physical self-presentation. People struggle to sort of present an ordered presentation of self amidst chronic disease. Self-care, as well as caring for others, is in many ways an issue of keeping people's bodies ordered, making sure that hair is well trimmed, making sure that clothes are not rumpled. That's a big part of caregiving for other people in terms of people that may have Alzheimer's disease or other advanced stages of dementia. And so care work is a key task in later life. Okay, so those are the sort of schools of thought and that have helped shape our understanding of disorder in these different spheres, physical spheres of life. But our job or our task is, in this project, is we're trying to think about, could there be some kind of interconnection between these layers of the environment, the neighborhood, the home, and the body? And we sort of use as our inspiration for thinking about the sort of ways that these layers of the environment could be connected Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. This theory says that the environments that are consequential for people's life course trajectories are multi-leveled and interconnected. They're not discrete from one another. In fact, they're actually like a set of nested structures, or like a set of Russian dolls. And so we really like that evocative imagery of the Russian dolls as a way of thinking about levels of socio-spatial environments as being interconnected. And we identify a couple ways in which there might be mechanisms underpinning a connection between the neighborhood to the home all the way to the body itself. One of those could be social stress mechanisms. So as much of the literature shows, living in chaotic, unpredictable types of environments, such as neighborhoods that are disordered, really give people a lack of control over their surroundings, erode people's sense of mastery, increase stress, increase distress. And we think that maybe those social stress mechanisms could be a way in which living in a disordered neighborhood sort of erodes people's wherewithal to help maintain order within their homes as well as upon their bodies. So it could be due to stress mechanisms, we hypothesize. Another thing we think that could explain this propagation of disorder across layers of space would be things that related to social bonds and to social control. So if we have neighborhoods that are disordered, the literature would suggest that those are spaces where there's also probably a lack of cohesiveness, a lack of collective efficacy. If we feel like our neighborhood is going to pot, then there's really no way for us to maintain this neighborhood as a well-kept, well-manicured space. It really kind of erodes the sense of neighborliness and collective efficacy that we can actually take control over our block. So perhaps those sorts of poor social bonds, poor social control in disordered neighborhoods would also lead to people feeling like they have little incentive to really necessarily project an image of orderliness on their own person or orderliness in their homes. It could erode the social support that they might need to actually have people help them take care of their houses as they get older and as they confront disability. It could be that there is a lack of incentive for others to come into their neighborhood or into their own homes, which could, again, disincentivize people from actually actively pursuing order in those types of spaces. So we see those as potential mechanisms. So here's what we see as our hypotheses that we're testing in this project. We're aiming to chart the propagation process. We would hypothesize that neighborhood disorder increases over time levels of household disorder. So that's our first hypothesis. Our second hypothesis would be that neighborhood disorder increases embodied disorder. So things flow from this sort of distal layer of the environment from the neighborhood to both the home and to the body. Hypothesis 3, we offer one view of this propagation process where perhaps over time household disorder and embodied sort of self-presented disorder are reciprocally related over time. And the sort of view from this comes from the health geographer Isabel Dyke from the UK, who writes about the sort of co-vulnerability of home space and body space and mutual constitution. She writes that homes are organized around bodily practices conform to the spatial form of the home, and each of these things is sort of renegotiated in this really fluid, ongoing reciprocal relationship. So one view is that over time, home and body sort of feed off each other. However, we also articulate what we would call a more fully propagative model. So perhaps it's not the case that home and body are sort of mutually reconstituted and reciprocal over time. Perhaps there's actually some sort of a mediated process, a sort of fully propagated sequence, such that the association between neighborhood disorder, hypothesis 4, and embodied disorder is mediated by, in hypothesis 4, household disorder. So household disorder is sort of the carrying place that helps chart neighborhood all the way to the home, all the way to the body. And hypothesis 5 then would say that household disorder leads to more embodied disorder over time, but not vice versa. So in contrast to that sort of back and forth reciprocal relationship between home and body, perhaps the body is actually the last holdout, the last thing to go in this sequence, from the distal layers of the environment all the way down to the geography closest in, the body itself. And so we call this the fully propagative model. The data we're going to use to test this propagation process is what's known as the National Social Life, Health and Aging Project, or the NSHAP. This is the only panel data we're aware of that has evaluations of the environment that aren't self-reported, that are actually people coming into these spaces where respondents are interviewed and actually offering their own judgment or score of what the environment looks like. So they're kind of unique. There's two waves of these data. The first wave was collected in 2005-2006 and included 3,000 respondents or so that are aged 57 to 85. And those people were followed up again 5 years later, 2010 to 11, and there was a pretty good retention rate. 75% of the wave 1 sample was re-interviewed at wave 2. Okay, so let's go to our key measures that we have. We have these measures of sociospatial disorder. They were offered by trained members of this research staff. They were trained to go into these spaces and to have sort of a common metric for evaluating neighborhoods, homes, and bodies of the respondents. They're known as the Field Interviewer Questionnaire, and this is based on the principles of systematic social observation that was first launched in this Chicago study by sociologist Robert Sampson some years before. What we do is we try to standardize the scores within interviewers. There were actually about 120 interviewers or so that were shipped out across all of the interview sites across the United States. And we kind of account for the fact that different interviewers may have somewhat different standards of what looks like cleanliness or what looks like disorder. So we basically standardize it as each interviewer having their own mean and their own deviation from that mean. So standard deviations within each of those interviewers. As it turns out, anecdotally, most of the interviewers were middle-aged women. There was some dispersion in terms of racialized minority women as the interviewers. Most of them were white women. So that is one thing to keep in mind and one of the caveats, I think, of this particular project.
Can I just pop a question in there? I mean, it's helping what you just said. I really have questions about the, what you call them, systematic social standards. I mean, that's different for everybody. I mean, I know in many situations where people have dementia and they're all these things, people are coming and saying, you really should do this, you should really cut your hair to look like this, and it's a fine line, to really determine what is order and what is disorder. The fact that this woman wants to have longer hair rather than shorter hair, that's her right, and that's not necessarily an indication of anything. Whereas, so I'm really curious to know what these, you've helped with a bit of this, how you come up with standard terms, but I'm very concerned that these get manipulated, as you said earlier, by various forces that want to impose on people their own personal sense of order, as opposed to, it's a tough one.
Yeah, indeed. And I'll show you the exact items that they're actually using and the way that they're trying to score these things. And to that I would just say, yeah, I agree with you. And I would say in this case, I would be more comfortable with a researcher, at least in an anonymized setting, doing these evaluations, uploading them into a data set where people can sort of look at the data that way and look for correlations in data. Where it becomes really problematic is especially when these observations become uses of social control by people who force people to make decisions in their lives against their choices, right? And so I guess to that, I think it's a good reflection on the way that judgments have consequences, right? And in certain contexts, they may have more consequences than others. So I think that point is really well taken. These are the actual items that were used, the actual measures that were used to define order and disorder. First, starting with the neighborhood. We're going to develop and sort of follow a previously devised scale back in 2014. One of the disadvantages, one of the problems we have with the data is that the full set of these neighborhood evaluations were actually only available at Wave 2. The survey team sort of expanded the scope at Wave 2. And so the ones that were consistent at both waves in terms of the neighborhood was this question that is offered in red font here. How well kept are the buildings on the street? Very well kept, fairly well kept, poorly kept, and very, very poorly kept. And so that is the sort of key measure of neighborhood disorder we're going to use, although we did run a lot of analyses that use the full scale as well. One of the ways, other sets of questions were sort of giving people two different anchor points on four different dimensions. Is the street or the block where this interview took place in the home clean versus full of rubble? Is it quiet versus noisy? Is it heavy traffic versus no traffic? And is there no smell or air pollution versus a strong smell or obvious pollution? And again, we fully acknowledge that these things are very context dependent as well as dependent upon the observer coming in. They really don't have a good way of differentiating between sort of up and coming, sort of gritty neighborhoods that maybe have a cool factor, that are maybe gentrifying, that maybe are seeing real estate values go up because they have this sort of urban edge to them, versus truly problematic and actually chaotic types of environments, think the destitute sections of Baltimore from The Wire, or other types of really bad places you might think of. And so we acknowledge that for sure, that these are limited in that sense. Nevertheless, they do load, we found, on a single factor in terms of factor analysis. They have good reliability put together. Where we actually have measures that are consistent across both waves, or when we get to household disorder and embodied disorder. These are the measures that were used for household disorder. There was a question about how well kept is the building in which this person lives, from very well kept to poorly kept. And they're also given these four descriptors. Is the house clean versus dirty? Is it neat and tidy versus messy? Is it quiet versus noisy? And is there no smell or pleasant smell versus a strong smell inside?
What does that mean? I mean, if I'm going into a South Asian household, it's going to smell like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in a good way for some people.
Yeah.
But then it'd be pleasant, right? So,
Yeah, that's a really good, I think that's a good question. I think some of these are obviously subjective in a deep sense.
Sorry,
And really, yeah, I agree. The smell of lemongrass to one might be more pleasant than to another person, or whatever else the smell might be. But, so here are the items that we have. And we've got, finally, embodied disorder, or sort of self-presentation. These questions, there's two of these that were asked at both waves. Is the person well-dressed or versus poorly dressed? And there could be any score, again, from 1 to 5. Those two anchor points are at the high end and the low end. And then hygienic versus not hygienic. One point that I'll raise as well is that we've actually asked to have access to these, the field training manuals, to actually see how they train these people. Unfortunately, they are deemed proprietary by NORC at the University of Chicago, and they have not released them to us. So we've actually wanted and asked if we could have some way to sort of see how is it that people are trained in these dimensions. We're really interested and keen to learn about that. One of the things, too, as well, is that these measures are only offered by one interviewer. So we don't really have the ability to sort of compare multiple interviewers and get inter-rater reliability, which would be a really good thing to do in this case. Nevertheless, we think that it is interesting that across, as we'll show in a second, different interviewers at wave 1 and wave 2, there does seem to be some kind of an interesting connection across waves and across different interviewers in many of these types of measures. So that's the two measures. These are what the distribution of those variables look like at wave 1 and wave 2 in terms of the interviewer standardized measures. When the interviewer standardized them, they're fairly normally distributed for all three of those dimensions of socio-spatial order and disorder, embodied, household, and neighborhood. We incorporate a number of other contextual variables. We use information from the US Census, knowing that neighborhood disorder, as the literature shows, is really a function in many ways of what's happening more broadly in neighborhoods and cities. So we look at concentrated disadvantage. This is a scale composed of the tract that's proportion poor on public assistance, female-headed households, the percentage of people unemployed, and so on. These are pretty well validated measures of concentrated disadvantage from the literature. We also look at census tract density to sort of account for whether these are more urban types of neighborhoods versus less densely populated spaces in which people are living. We also include controls for neighborhood collective efficacy, which incorporates things like reciprocated exchange. Basically, how much do neighbors in these spaces visit each other and talk to one another, as well as the sense of social cohesion. I'll come back in a few moments to talking a little bit more about some of the findings, especially related to social cohesion, whether people see their neighborhood more subjectively as being a close-knit neighborhood. We also account for a lot of health covariates, psychological covariates, as well as social covariates. I won't go into a lot of detail about these through the presentation of the findings today, but we're acknowledging that things like order in the household has been really linked to things like people's health, their disability, their psychological health. We control for a lot of these factors that are available in the National Social Health and Aging Project. We also control for things like how socially isolated or connected people are, knowing that those are probably strong predictors as well for many of the phenomena that we're interested in today. So I'll come back to some of these in a few moments, as well as some of the demographic covariates we adjust for, race, ethnicity, education level, household assets, gender, and age. To talk briefly about testing the hypotheses, I'm going to start with looking at hypotheses 1, 2, and 4. This is the idea that neighborhood increases household conditions of disorder, neighborhood disorder increases embodied disorder, and then finally, does there seem to be some kind of mediation process such that the household mediates the connection between the neighborhood and the body? We use, across 2 waves of data, lag-dependent variable methods, where we're basically controlling for the baseline conditions for each of our dependent variables and asking how much does some level of disorder predict increasing levels of disorder in home or in body above and beyond what those things were at baseline. I'll talk just briefly about these sort of models. The writing is small, but here is what we're doing in our regression analysis. We're starting, first of all, predicting household disorder at wave 2 as our dependent variable, controlling for lagged household disorder, so what household disorder was to start with. And what you'll see, these are standardized coefficients, or within interviewer standardized regression coefficients in linear regression. Neighborhood disorder at wave 1 is associated with increasing levels of household disorder at wave 2, net of all of the covariates that I mentioned a few slides ago. At wave 1, that's true of neighborhood disorder. So neighborhood disorder at 2005 predicts more household disorder in 2010. And neighborhood disorder, perhaps not surprisingly, at wave 2, so concurrent levels of neighborhood disorder are associated with even stronger level of household disorder itself at wave 2, which we'd expect because there is a 5-year gap between these 2 measurement occasions.
What did you do as people moved?
So yeah, that's a good question. So there were about 225 of the 2,000 people that moved, and we replicated the same analysis for people among the non-movers as well as people, including people that moved, and really the associations were the same in both groups. So these are just the sort of simplified case, but yeah, there were certainly a number of people that did move.
Okay, so just to clarify, so neighborhood, when you put in both neighborhood disorder time 1 and neighborhood disorder time 2, and the vast majority it's the same, though time 1 blew out and
That's
time
right.
2 remained, okay.
So as we might expect, if you take, concurrent levels of the neighborhood, it's going to have a much stronger association than the neighborhood did 5 years ago. But in terms of, we want to first establish, is there some kind of lagged effect of the distal temporal effect of the neighborhood further on the house in wave 2? Seems like there is, and then once you put in wave 2 neighborhood, it's a much stronger association. We follow that same kind of logic as well when we turn to embodied disorder or physical self-presentation types of disorder at wave 2. Here we find that there is, again, neighborhood disorder at wave 1 has a positive association over time with so-called embodied disorder at wave 2, net of the lagged value for embodied disorder from wave 1, which is again consistent with a propagation process. And again, once you then put the concurrent level of the neighborhood into the model, the current level seems to explain what was happening in the past, far stronger than the past could explain itself. And so there's that
So does
association.
that mean yuppified? If I lived in Regent Park and over the period where it was yuppified, the more attractive, more affluent community would be positively affecting me, just as well as
That's
going
right.
down could pull me down.
That's how it interpreted as well. So there's sort of a continuum from order to disorder, and so we're kind of conceptualizing this as the propagation of disorder over time. But yeah, I think you could make the claim that if a neighborhood is getting better, perhaps too, this would say that perhaps your household conditions will respond to what's happening in your neighborhood. So that's the speculation here for embodied disorder. And the third block here that I'll show is now the household disorder at wave 1 predicting embodied disorder, change in levels of embodied disorder across time. And again, it's a positive association such that if you have a disorderly household at wave 1, it seems to be associated with an increased level of embodied disorder across time, net of that lagged value of embodied disorder. And not surprisingly, across the 5 years, concurrent conditions are much more powerful than 5 years in the past were in terms of the household having an association with the body. Finally, when we include each of those variables together predicting embodied disorder at wave 2, there is still a strong association between the household disorder at wave 2 and the neighborhood disorder coefficient drops down to 0.05. You can look over left two columns over and it was 0.22, so it drops quite a bit. This would be consistent with the idea that part of why the household, part of why the neighborhood seems to matter is that it's perhaps working through what's happening in the household. It seems like the household is absorbing and carrying through much of that initial association of why the neighborhood would have mattered for the body itself. We did a lot more analyses here. I won't go into great detail. We did sort of a formal mediation analysis where we specifically looked at what is the total direct and indirect effect, neighborhood, household to body, how much does the effect of neighborhood get carried through the household up to the body. And we do find, consistent with this propagation process that we speculated on, that most of the effect of neighborhood is carried indirectly through the association of the household eventually to the body. Most of the total effect of neighborhood on the body is carried through by the household. So how do we summarize the set of analyses we've done so far? Seems to be that support for hypothesis 1 that neighborhood disorder is associated longitudinally with increases in household disorder. Hypothesis 2 has some provisional support. Neighborhood disorder is associated with increased embodied disorder over time, but whatever association there was between neighborhood down to the body seems, in light of hypothesis 4, to be characterized by a mediation process. So the association between neighborhood disorder and body disorder seems to be, statistically speaking, mediated by household disorder. Finally, the last sort of analyses I'll touch on briefly is the idea of hypothesis 3 and 5, trying to adjudicate between the reciprocal relationship over time between home and body, or the idea that perhaps there really is a more sequential, fully propagative process such that home and body aren't reciprocally related over time, but that the household seems to be associated with more embodied disorder over time. To do this, we use the cross-lag dependent variable mode of analysis, which we use with structural equation models. This is really the essence of the analysis. We're controlling for all of the covariates that I mentioned before. We're taking household disorder at wave 1 and embodied disorder at wave 1, and we're predicting these sort of autoregressive paths such that in the top part of the panel we see household disorder at wave 1. Does that predict household disorder at wave 1? Yes, it does. There is a sort of autoregressive path such household is associated with household over time. Much the same in the bottom two boxes. Embodied disorder at wave 1 is associated with embodied disorder at wave 2. That's the sort of autoregressive path. The more interesting paths are these sort of cross paths. The one from household disorder at wave 1 down to embodied disorder at wave 2, and embodied disorder, bottom left-hand corner, up to diagonally household disorder at wave 2. And what we find there is there doesn't seem to be this sort of reciprocal relationship such that home and body each have an identical association with each other over time. Instead, it looks that over time, household disorder, top left-hand corner, has a much stronger link down to embodied disorder at wave 2, 0.22 standardized units versus 0.03, 3 times as strong as the association from embodied disorder at wave 1 up to household disorder at wave 2. So it doesn't really look like there is evidence for embodied disorder being associated with further household disorder once we account for those autoregressive paths. So to summarize those models, provisionally we could say that household disorder looks like it is associated with more embodied disorder over time, but not vice versa. Household disorder, embodied disorder, reciprocally related, our hypothesis 3 doesn't look like it's supported at all. Doesn't look like there's this sort of reciprocal feedback at all over the course of time. We did a number of additional analyses. I won't go into great detail. We did try other specifications of this model using sort of fixed effects or change score types of models. It was really the same type of associations that we found. Speaking to this issue of those who moved versus those who didn't move, we tried that as well. It really wasn't any different in terms of the full model versus only looking at people who were the non-movers. We also considered, what if there's a reverse direction of propagation? What if the body goes to home to neighborhood, sort of as a dummy check? If you think there's any validity to our story about propagation of disorder, it wouldn't really make any sense to say that over time, embodied disorder increases household disorder, which increases neighborhood disorder as a whole, at least in 5 years' time. The neighborhood is subject to a lot more influences than one individual person who may be presenting themselves as orderly or disorderly. And sure enough, we don't find any evidence at all for that reverse propagation process, which I think lends at least some support to the idea that propagation does happen the way we expected it. Finally, the very last thing is we did test some interactions between disorder and a number of factors to sort of see whether this propagative disorder process that we outlined, does it seem to play differently for people of different genders, for people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds, for people that have different perhaps social resources in terms of their networks, or who people live in more or less cohesive types of neighborhoods. One of the things that we did find is that this link between the neighborhood disorder and household disorder, that signal over time seems to be stronger for people that have relatively small social networks. So people that are more isolated, there seems to be a stronger connection between the neighborhood having an influence in terms of its disorder on their level of household disorder over time. This shows the interaction effect there. The other interaction that we found was that for people that live in more socially cohesive types of neighborhoods, so people that tended to say that their neighborhood was very tight-knit, that people looked out for one another, that there was a lot of trust between neighbors, in those sorts of settings, we actually found that there was a stronger signal happening over time between the neighborhood conditions and the home conditions. Such that if you live in a really orderly type of well-manicured neighborhood and you say that your neighborhood is really tight-knit and socially cohesive, your home tended to be super extra well cared for. On the opposite end, if you lived in a more disorderly type of a neighborhood physically, and yet you said your neighborhood was very cohesive, very tight-knit, you tended to have an especially disordered type of home environment as well. So the link, the sort of picking up on those cues of order and disorder from the neighborhood into the home does seem to be carried stronger the more socially cohesive the neighborhood was.
Yeah, I just wonder, like, as social isolation increases, and perhaps, like, over time, gentrification is also happening in a neighborhood, couldn't that also, like, explain the relationship as, like, people of color or people of lower socioeconomic status are sort of, like, pushed out, and, like, the social connections are being fragmented, so they have less social support?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? And so in cases where maybe the optimal conditions where maybe neighborhoods are becoming less disorderly, there is a selection effect probably who's enabled or able to stay in those types of settings. The people pushed out the most are probably the people that are most vulnerable. So they may not be able to sort of perhaps experience the benefits maybe of
right, and that could probably work for
gentrification.
like any marginalized population that's getting moved out as, you know, the newcomers, sort of like reframe the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. And I wish we had more cases of people moving. We have about 225 movers across the waves. And then when you start to sort of parse that out by people that are moving into, you know, more orderly places or more disorderly places, you end up with kind of a small subset of people who are making those various types of moves. There may not be enough for us to look at that explicitly in our statistical analysis, but if there is, it would be a really interesting question to look at how the experience is different for those different types of trajectories of moving. So I think that's a really interesting point, yeah.
I'm just thinking, I know you're in the preliminary stages and it's your study's primarily North American based, but I'm just thinking sort of cross-nationally and cross-culturally, like how this would play out in a scenario in a developing world situation where you don't only have neighborhoods that are disordered, but like regions and cities and countries, and how you could apply this to them, and would it be accurate? Would it have, you know, where you don't have sort of the racial diversity that you're looking at here, where you have countries like Bangladesh where most people are usually of one and there isn't a whole lot of multiculturalism, and where the family is primarily taking care of older people. And in your study, I'm thinking of sort of old people living by themselves in decaying neighborhoods where in developing worlds, in developing countries rather, the family is at the core of usually taking care of an older person. So their body may not be in disorder, their neighborhood maybe, but the family usually supports them more so than in a North American context.
Yeah. I think that raises a whole lot of interesting questions and ideas. I mean, I think the whole idea, these scales that we're using that are validated from the US context, even trying to apply them, back to the point from earlier, what would it even look like to try to take some kind of a neighborhood disorder scale and then take that to Bangladesh, or, you know, or take that to some other developing context. I think you'd have to have a whole new way of operationalizing or even thinking through, conceptualizing what those environmental disorder measures look like in another place. I was actually just thinking as well, I've gotten this comment somewhat from European colleagues who take cities in Denmark or in Sweden where concentrated disadvantage and this sort of racial exclusion that's so characteristic of many urban contexts, especially in the United States, just doesn't exist. And so the idea even of things like concentrated disadvantage or these sort of horribly disordered contexts in places like Baltimore or Milwaukee, where you really do have breakdowns of physical order, that's really not characteristic of cities in these other, perhaps more developed Western countries in Europe. And so I think whether you're talking about developing countries or these sort of really, really well-developed countries in, say, Western Europe, I think we'd have to really think through the context very differently. And so I think this really doesn't generalize. I think this propagation of disorder process that we're trying to think through, I think is probably much more North American and maybe even US specific relative to some of these other places. I think that's a really interesting point. So in terms of wrapping up here, and again, these are great comments, and I really welcome other pushback and ideas that you have. We think that there is some evidence, at least provisionally, for the stepwise progression from neighborhood, home to body. No evidence of mediation by stress processes or social bonds. I didn't get into this, but we did actually try to see whether this propagation process, this overtime connection between neighborhood and home, neighborhood and body, home and body, whether it changed, whether we accounted for things like stress and distress, frailty, disability. We really didn't find that those factors were able to mediate any element of this propagation process. So that remains a little bit of a mystery in our minds. We did, however, find that there were some of these moderation patterns, such that those with few confidants, sort of small networks, and those who live in tight-knit neighborhoods do seem at least most susceptible to neighborhood-driven household decline, so the connection between neighborhood disorder and household disorder. But yet there was no moderation we found in this link from home to body across time. So limitations, and this is the first one that I have on the slide, validity of physical disorder measures. I think we need to really think through carefully in terms of, are these valid measures? In many ways, disorder and order are in the eye of the beholder. That being said, there is a lot of research that has used these same scales and found that they do predict things like likelihood of falling over time, stress and distress among people, even mortality. So as well, some of the research in social work that's looked at things like self-neglect and squalor as being predictors of depression over time and of mortality seems in some ways to pick up some of the same themes that these measures are trying to run with. So I wouldn't go so as far as to say that I'm at a crisis mode in terms of believing the validity of the measures, but I do think qualitative research would be a really helpful thing to really unpack this a lot more. As I mentioned, the full neighborhood disorder scale was really only available at wave 2, so we have a lot of measurement error issues with only that single item, trying to use that across waves. Only 2 NCHAP waves are currently available as a third limitation. There is a third one about to drop any day now, and so we're eager to get our hands on looking at 3 waves to sort of see whether this propagation process, we can strengthen this analysis with a third wave. Just in terms of takeaways, we're looking for really to push in this project really tighter integration between urban sociology and social gerontology. There's been a really long debate over whether physical disorder can erode things like social trust and increase crime. This is the sort of classic broken windows thesis in the criminology and urban sociology literature. But what we found is that sort of insights of social disorganization theory and broken windows has really been pegged to young men's behavior. If you see disorder in the neighborhood, what's the impact on young men in the neighborhood who might be vandalizing things, mugging people, committing violent acts? What we're trying to really think of through is how could we apply the thinking of broken windows theory perhaps to the aging population, people that are aging in place, and sort of take a spin-off of that sort of old school broken windows theory and ask what might be the implications for older people aging in place in declining areas for things like self-care, for presentation of self, for maintenance of a home space. And so we can sort of think maybe about reconceptualizing this old school broken windows theory and ask about, can we apply it to the preservation of physical conditions where people live? Broken windows, not to crime perhaps, but to dirty kitchens to rumpled clothes. Could we have this sort of broken windows process happening at sort of various spatial scales among the older population? Another point that we'd like to make is that person-environment fit models in gerontology, which really do give us, I think, the best insights into how home environments matter for older adults. They really are kind of short-sighted, we think, in that they don't oftentimes take into account what's happening outside the front door. How about the physical environment sort of having a ripple effect? How do neighborhoods and these broader structural conditions in the city trickle into what happens in people's homes? And so thinking through those layers of the environment really hasn't been done as much as we work
to look at
affect people's immune systems, whether they affect things like stress processes under the skin. But we'd like to ask, how can disorder come to be expressed upon the body in terms of people's self-presentation? We really like to undertake more qualitative work to ask how seniors negotiate their physical self-appearance amidst disorder in their environment. How do they succumb or resist physical surroundings when performing self-care, when presenting an image of themselves? And we haven't found much research that's really tackled those sorts of questions. And we think it's important because, as I mentioned really at the outset, the way people present themselves, especially in later life, has implications for how they're treated by social service providers, how they're treated by agents of social control. And in many ways, this becomes a very punitive process, such that failure to sustain bodily order can really threaten a person's capacity to remain a part of mainstream society, to be a fully accepted member and affirmed member of a community. And so we'd like to sort of do research that helps understand at least how self-presentation is linked to these broader factors in the environment. Thank you to my co-authors for their work on this project, and again, thanks for the NSHAP authors for making the data available to us to use. And thank you so far for all the comments we've gotten. And if we have any moments remaining, I'd really like to hear any pushback or ideas that you might have.
Great. Well, first, a round of applause. A few 5 minutes until I know some people have to go, and maybe even afterwards. Does anyone else have any other comments or questions?
Thank you. That's an elegant linkage between theory and empirical work. There was one issue that's sort of puzzling to me, which is that link from the body or embodiment back to the home. And I think, and so my question there is, can you remind us what were the measures of embodiment? One was clothes, right? Something to do with the clothes. Because I think that's where I'm getting tripped up about it, because I want to think about that as a measure of, okay, so hygienic versus not hygienic. Okay.
And what hygienic means, again, I would really love to see the training manual that this team used, whether it has to do with dental features or hair or smell or odors. That can encompass a lot of things, I think.
Yeah, because I think I was getting tripped up thinking, like, well, if their body isn't functional, but this isn't a measure of their functional abilities, then how could that not possibly impact their home environment? But along those lines, do you have any measures of whether there's like a personal support worker in the home, or a housekeeper, or family members who can take care of the tidiness? Is that something that's available?
Yeah, so we do know how many other people live in the household, and so we included that as one of our controls in the analysis. But that isn't a very specific measure about what those people do, how much they contribute to care, even if they are caregivers with some respect. There isn't a question at both waves of the survey, I don't believe, that asks about, do you receive care from anyone living in your home? Unfortunately.
Okay, so it's just a limitation indeed,
Sure.
but it is kind of a black box, right?
Yeah.
Like, you might think that if there is somebody in some households and not others, that it's more than just...
Yeah. So we replicated this analysis too among people that lived alone and whether people lived with others, and it was actually, we couldn't distinguish any difference in the propagation process across neighborhood, home, body, in any of those cases, whether it was living apart or with others. But we might expect, we kind of hypothesize that there could be a moderating effect. Whether you lived with others, then maybe there's other people there to help take care of these things.
Yeah, or they could make it messier too.
Or they could contribute, yeah, they could contribute to that too. Yeah, thanks.
I was just gonna, I started to think about what you were saying maybe in the context of nursing homes. I don't know if that's something that you considered at all, but when I think about nursing homes or like assisted living homes, everyone's in a really tight, kind of knit, even more so tight-knit community because everyone's so close together. And I know that they do, they usually like have bingo and different things that they put on within those kind of places. So I wonder if that would have any influence as well. Because I know, I mean, everybody's kind of at a different stage, right, when they're in a nursing home. So I'd be interested to see how that would kind of influence.
Yeah, that's
how people are
interesting.
doing.
So I think I neglected to mention that these are really only community dwelling people. So we're not able to include anyone that lives in nursing homes or assisted living or anything like that. But yeah, in terms of like, if propagation of disorder, as we've a term that use that concept, if that means anything, then I think you would be able to expect to go into and find differences within those really close-knit communities, spatial communities as well as social levels of being tight-knit, and find that perhaps you might hypothesize that nursing homes that are very well kept and well manicured, and many of the external features of it or the common areas, that is also associated with how people tend to their own immediate spaces that they live in. And so that would be an interesting context to test this idea of propagation of disorder, or how people maintain order by picking up cues and align their own order-keeping behavior to the more external surroundings. So I think, yeah, you could test that in that sort of environment. That would be interesting.
I just had actually two comments. One is, I think many of my colleagues have done work on age-friendly communities, and the potential of positively influencing it is very profound. I know you're looking at a downward spiral, but the potential of an upward spiral is quite exciting, because if it holds as consistently and moving up and improving the community and improving sort of the neighborhood, it should move forward in general, which would be exciting.
Yeah, so the idea, I think I was thinking of there is that, we have there's a lot of really interesting social science studies that really target youth and young people that do things like this. So the Moving to Opportunity study was this famous study in the US where they take kids that are really disorderly type of urban environments, transplant them to this sort of cleaned up, well manicured suburbs, and they find, okay, do we see an improvement in high school graduation or mental health? But it's always kids they're interested in, right? They're not really so interested in, can we move older people from crumbling places, and will we then see improvements in their lives if we move them to a different type of a neighborhood setting? I think, to me, it's puzzling why we haven't focused on those sorts of interventions for older people in a lot of these social science objectives as for younger people.
Within the age-friendly context, even aging in place has the potential, the place can be greatly ameliorated by a variety of interventions at the municipal and or federal or local, just putting resources in. So it's very positive, and I actually haven't seen this theoretical interpretation of how age, it's sort of a more one-to-one, well, if it's safe, I'm going to go for a walk. Bill Satriano has done some work on that. And if I walk, I'm going to be physically healthier, those types of things. But sort of to see it in a more holistic and beautifully integrated, as I follow up with that comment that your way of integrating theory and practice and your findings is very interesting. Do you have one last
Well,
comment?
to say that, as far as that goes, some of you know I live at Hesperus Village in Cornhill, and this is very much our mission. And we do bring in a lot of folks who are referrals from mental health, seniors in distress, and we work very actively with the whole, how can we really, just as you were describing, how can we help that to happen? And to a small extent it does happen, so it's a great spot if anybody wants to come and do research. I'm sure we could set it up. Our most powerful volunteer committee in the building is the aesthetics committee. So it's not just order, but beauty. Like how are we really taking care of having an aesthetic environment? So that's very powerful. So it goes beyond just order, but beauty.
All right. Well, another round of applause. Thank you so much. have a little token of our appreciation, if we can get to it. Sorry, you're kind of trapped in here. No, sorry. Here we go. Okay. Super. So thank you so much, and it was very interesting.
Thanks for having me.